The most important part to any zoo is the animals in the enclosures they call home. Throughout the series, I'll be designing different enclosures for an array of animals, whilst also keeping guest interaction at the forefront of every build. Join me each week as I tackle a new enclosure and idea and try and bring it to life within Planet Zoo. Today I'm building a king penguin enclosure. My idea was to have a massive pool with underwater viewing area at the front of the build and have an elevated island towards the back and surrounding the pool. I've also added plenty of snowy rocks around to give off the cold Arctic feel. Here are the stats for the king penguin. As you can see, land and water requirement is very important, as well as the depth of the water. Here's something that surprised me, the social structure for the king penguin, and I was very shocked by the group sizes that you could have. My enclosure will not have that many penguins in. Cracking straight on with the build, I started with the island towards the back of the enclosure, and as you can see I'm using quite a large surface area. In the end I do think I went a bit extreme with the size of the enclosure and the size of the penguins themselves, but I guess it's better to have that extra space, as I did also put a walkway up there, so that took up some of the space. Now I'm working on the bits of the island that will run down the side of the pool, and to do this you just fill it in with some fencing or panelling of your choice. For this example I used the thick glass panelling, and then you fill in the hole there with the water. Next up was the rock work, and for this I used the snowy rocks. As we all know, I'm a massive fan of using rock work in my builds, especially to cover up this large mound which obviously holds the island. There is some icy rocks you can use, but I wasn't very keen on them and they didn't really look right, whereas these snowy ones work perfectly. So I started off by filling the front of the enclosure here because I knew I wanted a walkway in front of that glass, as well as a nice little themed area between the footpath that runs up to the glass panelling and the main path away from the enclosure, because I wanted this part of the zoo to feel like its own little area, very similar to the Africa part. So I tried different things, and here I'm adding this higher walkway. I wanted it just to be a dead end, mainly for spacing, but because there was this upper walkway, it did mean there was a lot of keeper area on show. So when it came to making the facade, it was important to carry it along all the way down so that guests couldn't really see any of the keeper areas. Something I wanted to tease in this build was a future project, and here at the front corner here I have plans for another animal enclosure. That's why I'm elevating this bit of the wall a bit more, and also guests aren't really going to see the penguins from there. Now for a little bit of a break from the rock work, it was time to sort of lay out where the penguin house would be. Now because I had such an awkward shaped island, I didn't really know how big to make the house and what sort of shape to go with, so there's a lot of funky curves in this, and it's a very awkward shape, but when building the facade, which we'll see shortly, it kind of hides that funny shape and probably makes it look a bit more square to the guest point of view. The break from the rock work over, I decided to make a start here so that guests couldn't see the keeper area, and what I'm doing is just using more of the same rocks that I used around the edge, just to build up that facade and really enclose that space. I also sort of done the lower bits here that obviously would only be viewable to keepers, I think, just to make it look a bit smarter and more finished off. To help speed up the process, I used these large rocks at the front, and I didn't fill the entire house all the way around because I'm not sure what I want to do with that backspace, whether it would be more keeper areas or lead to other enclosures, so I didn't want to waste space with rocks, especially as this front part is the only thing viewable to guests. A nice little touch that I saw was adding this rock to make a sort of rim around the edge of the enclosure where the fencing would go. Now the barriers, I was a bit unsure what to use, but I used the thick glass again, and this was very fiddly because obviously the ground was different levels, so it meant just going around the enclosure and sort of leveling it all out, making sure that it wasn't too high because obviously that's not necessarily important for the penguins, and also making sure it wasn't blocking guests' view. I'd done this on both sides of the enclosure with a glass panelling, and then the bits that were outside of guest view, I used the knoll barriers as it wasn't really necessary to have any fencing round there. The final part of the barrier work was getting in the keeper gate, and here we do have the elevated path, so it's just trying to find a nice way to connect it up to the rest of the other keeper areas. So one important thing I knew about this build was the coolers that were needed, obviously to have the snow on the ground because this is quite a warm map. So I placed several coolers around the enclosure, and then came the tedious task of placing loads of electrical units to power them because the ones I already had didn't reach the enclosure space. So I'd done all that off camera, and then overall I was really happy with the result, even though there was some patches of mud. I guess it added different textures to the enclosure. I've just added solar panels to the roof of the penguin house, which is very similar to what I'd done with the mountain goat enclosure earlier in the series. And this time I added two, just to get as much power to those coolers as possible. Like with every build, it was time to finish off with some shrubs and the enrichment and food and water items. Now with the shrubs, I didn't want to overdo it too much, so I had these patches of grass dotted around the island, and then I placed some bits inside the water. Overall, I'm really happy with this build, and the underwater viewing area is something I've wanted to try for a while, so I'm really glad I finally got round to doing that, and the king penguin was the perfect animal to trial that on. The only thing I would change about this build is the size of the enclosure, but I guess it means I can have hundreds of penguins within this habitat.